Hi everyone, this is Nia. I hope you had a wonderful Christmas. Today I decided to paint something simple to end the year. You know how much I love painting leaves, so I made a simple winter version. This is inspired from one of my Christmas cards, and I'm going to paint this completely freehand without any outlines. So let's start by going straight to the colors. This is Vermilion by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Payne's Grey Bluish by Schmincke, Permanent Yellow Deep by Holbein, and Burnt Umber by Holbein. I'm also going to use my Finetec Gold. I will be painting this freehand, but I know it might be a bit difficult to see if you're new to watercolor, so I'm going to sketch out the shape so hopefully it's a bit more clear, and this can be something that you practice before painting your own spread. So this will be the shape of the first element that I paint. The leaves are rounded at the tip and it looks like a teardrop, and I like to place them mostly at the tips of the branches as well as the sides, depending on how they're growing out and depending on the composition that you're trying to fill. How I'll paint this is very similar to how I draw it. I just direct my brush the same way as how I've drawn it out, and you can practice painting the shapes on scrap paper before applying it to your spread, and of course this method also applies to other elements. Later in the painting, I'll be adding some overlapping leaves as well so I can play with the values, and take note that the branches for this first one is flowy rather than rigid. And if you don't like the leaf shape, you can also change it to regular leaf shapes or others you can think of. Now let's paint the first leaf shapes. I'm going to get my paint ready. I'm just taking a lot of permanent yellow deep here since I'm somewhat cleaning my palette as well. I don't really need too much permanent yellow deep, but I'm just going to have it to the side for easy access. Then I reactivated a lot of Payne's Grey Bluish and a lot of Buff Titanium because that's going to be my main color mixture. This has the tiniest bit of permanent yellow deep, so it's a bit of a minty pastel green, but I personally prefer this to be a bit more blue, so I'm going to adjust it later. I don't mind the slight color variation though, so I'm going to keep painting with it for now. You can see that I'm painting branch by branch, so I can build it up along the way, and since I want this to be a diagonal composition, I'm starting at the bottom left to direct everything upwards to the center for now. Here you can see that I've adjusted the color, so it's a bit more bluish. And as for the branch, I like to use a thick consistency and a light brush load, so it's a bit easier to control the paint. Or you can also switch to a small brush, which I'm going to later do just for the ease of it. And as for the leaves, I like to use a light to medium consistency, so I can play with the values later as I overlap the leaves. By the way, I think this would also look really cute if you fill both of the spreads completely as a pattern, but I don't know, for some reason I just wanted to play with some negative spacing for this composition, which is why I've chosen to paint this diagonally. The next element that I'm going to add are tiny little birds sitting on the branches. They're going to be very small, as you can see, but let me try to break down the shapes. I like to think of just two circles, a smaller one for the head and a larger one for the body that's a bit more oval. Then I just connect everything together. Since the birds are very small, I'm going to make it very simple with just the eyes and the beak to finish it off. I'm also going to add a bit of color for the wings later on. With this two circle method, you can play with how they're positioned as well. You can make them face the side or even have its back turned towards us. I'm just going to draw a few options here, and this is something that you can play around with and practice before you apply it to your paintings. For this one, I've made too much of a curve for the back of the bird, which is why it looks kind of hunched. So don't make that mistake. I would make the back relatively straight if the bird is facing the side. With this said though, the birds are still going to be very small, and it's okay to not be dead accurate, but this is just a simplified way of thinking of the bird shape, so hopefully it makes a bit more sense. Now, starting with the first base color for the body, I'm just using a medium consistency of buff titanium. Then, while the surface is still the slightest bit damp, I'm going to use burnt umber to paint the wings, or you can also use a mix of burnt umber and a tiny bit of Payne's Gray Bluish for a darker color. Payne's Gray Bluish and burnt umber makes almost like a black, so that's the color that I initially used to paint the face, but just for the ease of it, I ended up switching to my 0.1 ink pen. After painting a few birds, I'm going to go back to paint the previous leaves, and I forgot to mention this before, but you can see that for some of the leaves I've left out some white space. This is not necessary to do, I just don't mind the look of it, but it's completely unintentional. If I accidentally left it out, then I'm going to leave it there, but if I fill in the whole leaf, that's also fine. Now let's move on to the next leaf shape, which will be the pine leaves. I like to either start by painting the center or the stem, then add lines to direct upwards, but in a slight angle for the leaves. Sometimes I like to make the lines slightly curved so it looks more organic, and to make them look more flowy, I like to direct the curves both outwards and inwards. When I'm painting, I'm just going to direct the leaves everywhere like how I drew it out before, but if it's easier, you can also paint it facing inwards first, then add a few curving outwards like what I'm doing here. I want the color of the pine leaves to be a bit more green, so this has a bit more permanent yellow deep in the mixture compared to the previous leaf, and also a bit of burnt umber to mute the color slightly. I personally find it easier to draw the stem first, but I try to make it lighter than the leaves, so it's not too overpowering. I'm just drawing it or painting it the same way as how I sketched it out before. But to control the lines and make them nice and delicate, I would suggest for you to use a dry to light brush load, so the paint doesn't travel out of the bristles too fast, creating too much puddles. Next, I'm going to use the same color but without the buff titanium, so it's a darker version of the same color. I'm going to paint more leaves on top, but I want to leave out some of the lighter leaves showing from the base, and this will just suggest a little bit of depth. Now that the birds are completely dry, I just added some tiny little feet, a beak, and eyes using my pen. The next thing I'm going to add are branches of cherries or berries. This time I made the branches more rigid and less flowy or curvy. You can see that I stopped before directing or redirecting the branches in different angles. Then I'm going to add circles for the berries at the tip of the branches and a little bit more just floating near the branches. I'm also going to leave out some negative space to give a bit of shine to the berries. Now let's paint the branches. For the color, I'm going to use a mix of Payne's Gray Bluish and burnt umber. And just like the pine leaves, I'm painting this using almost like a dry brush or a light brush load so it's easier to control the load, and the lines can be thin and delicate. I'm going to make them grow out of the first leaf branches that I made. This is why I left some areas empty, so there's a bit more space to add on more elements. After I'm done adding a few branches, I'm going to then add the berries. For this, I'm just using a thick consistency of vermilion, and I start by painting a circle, then filling in the gaps, but also leaving a tiny dot in the middle or around the sides for the shine. To paint this, you can also use your small brush, but I personally find it easier to use this brush since it can hold more water, and if you accidentally filled in the whole circle for the berries, that's also okay. It'll just look slightly different. After filling the branches, I feel like I want to spread some red berries for the empty areas on the left. And after that, I quite like where the composition is going, but I feel like I need to add some darker values as well. So I'm going to go over some of the main leaves and use a darker version of the same color. So this just has less buff titanium or none at all. And I'm just going to paint over it and paint a couple which overlaps the previous ones I painted earlier. I'm quite happy with the combination of the values so far. So next I'm going to paint more or less the same thing from the top right hand corner, painting the same elements we've painted so far, and I'm going to let them meet the previous spread at the center. I'm not going to walk you through this part though, because it's basically just a repeat of the same steps. So I'll get back to you once we're ready to move on to the next step, where we'll be adding the sparkly gold leaves. I feel like the composition is getting there, but while I add on these little details to the tiny birds, I'm wondering what you all did for Christmas this year. Do you have some special family traditions that you do? It'll be really interesting to read it in the comments. Since I have a long distance marriage with my husband, I'm really thrilled that this year I get to spend Christmas with him. Christmas is also his birthday, so it's extra special. And despite knowing each other for more than a decade now, this year is actually only the second time we've ever spent Christmas together, or we will spend Christmas together. His family lives in a city quite far from Jakarta, and he used to go back every Christmas since he doesn't get to see his family often. So yeah, this is definitely going to be a really exciting one for me. I'm sorry for getting a bit confusing with the tenses since this is pre-filmed and I'm still in Jakarta as I'm talking, but I'm really super excited for this Christmas and I hope you had an amazing one as well. But anyway, that's enough rambling from me. Now let's get back to the painting. Once the composition meets in the middle, I'm going to add some snowballs, but after painting a few, I felt like I wanted to add some extra sparkles so it feels more festive, and then I'll add the snowballs after to fill in more space lightly if I need to. For the golden branches later, I'm going to treat it the same way as how I painted the branches for the cherries, so they're a bit more rigid. Initially, I just want to make them into branches, but by the end of it, I ended up adding some leaves. I feel like this adds a bit more life to it instead of it looking like a dry, arid composition. I'm going to limit the amount of leaves that I add though, because I want them to only act as small accents. If you have any other metallic colors, you can also use those, but I just have different shades of golds. So this is the one that I picked, which is a bit more of a yellow gold, so it stands out against the white background. These paints can be a bit difficult to activate sometimes, so I like to leave some water on top before picking up the paint. I want to use a really thick consistency because I want the sparkle to be strong and opaque. Just like the berries, I'm going to paint the branches first, and this way it's a bit easier for me to distribute them within the composition without focusing too much on one small area. Then once I have an even distribution, I'm going to add on the leaves using the same thick consistency of the same gold. Once I've added enough gold leaves, I'm going to have a look around the composition again. I feel like the transition from the leaves to the negative space looks a bit too abrupt for my liking, so I'm going to add some snowballs in a light consistency with just buff titanium, and I'm going to place this close to the main features. I'm going to try to not add too much, and I also want to play with the size of the snowballs for a bit of variety. I'm just going to paint a few more of these, and that's basically it for this doodle, the last tutorial for this year. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please consider subscribing for more. Thank you so much for watching to the end, and I'll see you again in a brand new year. Bye!